Well, hello, good evening. Welcome to Introduction to Gender and Women's Studies. My name is Rachel Hanson. Um, if this is your first time joining us, welcome. Ooh, forgot to turn my phone down. We are at this point, and this is really difficult for me to believe, um, but we are almost at our last class together for this fall semester. So if you are new here, Um, there are, what? Not counting today, there are 10 weeks of content that you can, wade through, pick and choose on your own, um, that hopefully you find to be helpful. But this week, what we are talking about is the power of looking, and very specifically the idea of the gaze, and that's GAZE. Sometimes when you're talking about gender studies, you could be talking about a different group of gays. Not the case this week. Um, and how looking or gazing can really impact like your sense of self, your sense of community, and how you're conceptualizing the world around you. Now we can't really have this conversation without talking about Bell Hook's essay, "The Oppositional Gaze." So we'll be talking about that a little bit. Um, and then we'll also spend a little time talking about actually a really excellent undergraduate analysis of the video game Cyberpunk 2077. Um, and end by talking about kind of video game tropes broadly as it relates to kind of how women show up in video games and in other forms of popular media. Now, before really diving into this, um, so it's been a day, wasn't it? Right now, I'm doing this live on November 19th, 2025. Uh, so if you're watching this later and you're going, wow, yeah, actually, November 19th was a rough day. At least you know that you're not alone. Like, it's just it's been a time. So I really have been looking forward to this all day. It's kind of a way to reset myself before winding down for the evening. Um, so, with that, kind of just acknowledging how we're feeling in time and in space, we're going to open with a quote from the essay, The Oppositional Gaze. Now, again, this is Bell Hooks, um, who says, again, and I quote, "The gaze has always been political in my life. Imagine the terror felt by the child who has come to understand through repeated punishments that one's gaze can be dangerous. The child who has learned so well to look the other way when necessary. Yet, when punished, the child is told, um, look at me when I talk to you. Only the child is afraid to look. Afraid to look, but fascinated by the gaze. There is power in looking." End quote. Now, I really don't think it's possible to have a productive conversation about popular culture, um, and gender studies or feminism without this type of grounding, right? Talking about how we perceive the gaze and uh, the feeling of power, right? Like of bearing witness to things, um, but also that feeling of being afraid. And that is true, of course, in children, but it can also be true in us as adults. Uh, now, In her article, Bell Hooks uses the 1951 sitcom Amos and Andy uh, to talk about kind of a good popular culture example of the power of gazing and the changing nature of the gaze. Um, I'm gonna be real honest. I have never watched Amos and Andy. Um, Sitcoms from 1951 are not really my jam. Um, but she talks to us about this character named Sapphire, who is played by Ernestine Wade. Um, Sapphire was a regular foil in the show. Um, her generation of viewers, um, Hooks says again, and I quote, "We did not long for her." Like, Ernestine was not a sympathetic character to young viewers, but grown women had a different response to Sapphire, right? Um, they really identified with her frustration, and they resented the way that she was mocked. And this is partial quote and partial here in my own words. Um, and I really have tried to contextualize this for myself as we as I'm thinking about different, like, contemporary examples of popular culture, and how that might change, right? And how that perception changes as I get older. When I was writing this module, one example that I thought of almost right away was the animated Little Mermaid film. Um, I think that most of us, uh, if for no other reason, that Disney is deeply pervasive in our lives, which could be a whole module on its own, but in some gender and women's studies classes is a whole module on its own. We are familiar with The Little Mermaid, again, because of the pervasiveness of Disney in the culture that we live in and here in North America. Ariel declares to her father, "I'm 16 years old. I'm not a child anymore." Now, as a kid watching that, I was like, yeah, should be taken seriously. Look at how old she is. Now I am a lot older. And hopefully you can tell that I am not a teenager. Um, and while Ariel is extremely sympathetic, um, I do struggle to not laugh out loud at that line when I still watch that film with my own kids. Like, how I'm viewing Ariel as a character has changed from childhood to adulthood. Um, and that's really something for us to think about, right? As we are watching and rewatching media. Um, I'm going to take this opportunity to sip my tea and also to show off my mug, um, because you might have guessed I'm a pretty big Star Trek fan. And you don't need to see my mug to see that. You can just look behind me, um, right, like right here or over here, and literally me Substack Live, and you'll know the people that live in this house really like Star Trek. Um, and so it is true, right, that across subsequent viewings of Star Trek, and there have been many for me, our view of the characters changes. Well, my gaze changes across viewings, even when I'm consuming the same media. So really, like within this article itself, Bell Hooks really lets us sit in this feeling of how consuming media has power, um, and how it can really help or hurt feelings of coming home to ourselves and feeling maybe more awake and more aware in our own skin. Um, so I am curious, both as you are like reading this article and you're thinking about this in your own life, and the media that you consume, what are some things that make you feel like you're coming home to yourself? And what are the things where you really have to suspend a lot of who you are to enjoy whatever that media is. I think it could be worth a think. Uh, Now, the next thing that we are talking about is an example of a very specific video game. Now, similarly to Amos and Andy, I have not played Cyberpunk 2077, uh, but I am aware of the game and somewhat familiar with the premise. Um, my spouse, Nathan, and I'm like gesturing in this direction because I heard him walk in the door as I was getting started with this. So he is just downstairs in my home, in our home together. I'm being really weird right now. Um, he plays video games in a way that I find is very interesting. Um, and I enjoy watching him play it. And that he plays his video games in chronological order. So Cyberpunk 2077 is coming up in the chronology. Uh, so I will get to watch some gameplay here before too long, but I haven't seen any yet. Um, but this podcast episode, right, this analysis of Cyberpunk 2077 kind of went off the rails there for a sec. Um, Caleb and Johnny, who are both students in gender and intersectional identities in video games at Lawrence University, about 3 years ago, discuss how the gaze at the beginning of Cyberpunk 2077 is very clearly coded for heterosexual males. Um, and I was really, and perhaps unfairly, surprised and impressed by their analysis. Um, right, I would not necessarily have expected two presumably relatively young men to deliver such a thoughtful analysis. And they did. So kudos to their professor, and also to themselves for really engaging in that content. I think that that's really impressive. Um, but one thing that they talked about pretty extensively, and I say extensively for a 15-minute podcast episode, um, is how characters come across and how the conversation that they hear from non-player characters or NPCs uh, really kind of contextualizes the world around them, which is the whole point, right, of NPCs. Uh, and then they spend a good amount of time talking about how bizarre it is that although Cyberpunk 2077 is set in this dystopian future world, excuse me. Remember when I said it had been kind of a long day? Uh, that gender roles remain a driving force within that society. Um, and they conclude by saying there are no society rules except for patriarchy. And I want to sit with that here for a minute because really, Cyberpunk 2077 got a lot, and I do mean a lot, of flack for having constantly been delayed. Um, this is off the top of my head, but I want to say it was delayed for about 5 years from the time that they said they were going to release it to the time that it was, in fact, actually released. Um, and so it's interesting in a distressing sort of a way to me, anyway, that despite having taken a longer than average time to create this video game, which by all accounts is extremely detailed and immersive, but that the creators couldn't, evidently, step back enough to conceptualize a society where patriarchy wasn't king in the social hierarchy. Um, and so I think really, again, just something to think about, right? Like um, if you are a creator of things, the society that we live in is so baked into us um, that you might not even realize it. Um, so taking that time to imagine a different world, a world that is fully different um, from the world that we are presently in, I think it deserves the time. And I think that we deserve to, in a way, live in that struggle, right? Uh, it's uncomfortable, but it's the type of discomfort that we deserve to get to something better. And now this brings us to our very last piece of the evening. And I'm going to interrupt myself here for a second just to say, um, I wish I had allowed myself a little more time to make my tea because it's a little bit hotter than I would like for sipping at this time. But that's what happens when you futz around for a little too long. Now, the last concept that we're going to be talking about this week um, is really kind of the originally a literary concept, but now, right, like a concept that is found across media. That is the damsel in distress. Now, I'm assuming that most of us know what a damsel in distress is. Um, but the feminist frequency video that is linked in this module gives us a really fantastic breakdown, both of the concept, um, as a plot device, um, but Anita Sarkeesian really focuses in on the damsel in distress as a plot device in video games. Now, this is a two-part video. I have only linked to the first part, but if you have an hour, watch both of them. They are excellent. Uh, Now, this is a topic that I really like. I very specifically wanted to bring up within this module. Sorry, I'm talking with my hands too much, like below camera, and so I keep like hitting my desk. Um, anyway, I really wanted to bring this up because the idea of the helpless woman is pervasive in our culture. Um, and it's something that really does hurt us all. Uh, Now, while some media is starting to catch up, Star Trek Picard is, in all three seasons, is an example is something that I think is a great example of media catching up. Um, but really, the long-standing assumption is that women need saving. But this isn't something that's just showing up in our stories, right? Um, this is also something more specifically that is showing up in the policy that gets passed that has strong influence over our lives. Like, I don't know if you remember last week when we talked a little bit about um, public benefits. Right? That is an example of women needing to be saved from the bad guy, right? Heavy square scare quotes there. Um, it also shows up in how we treat each other, right? If we are treating an entire demographic of people as people who are just kind of hanging around to be saved, that's going to influence how we live our lives. And that's not really something that I think that we need. I'm sorry, sometimes I'm looking through this and I realize the errors that have been made by me, which also um, sometimes it gets to be a long semester. That's for sure. Um, but as we're thinking about this, right, as we're thinking about how we are looking at things or not looking at things, right? What we're actively choosing to spend our time with. Um, and how the creation of different societies requires a lot of imagination, um, and time and discomfort, and how we are imagining and how we are trying to treat others around us. It's, it really is very valuable. So as you kind of go out into this, I am curious. How has media shaped your approach to gender? And as ever, if you have any questions after the fact, feel free to comment them. Like, I check them pretty regularly. Um, but this is a pretty quick module, despite me being excited about talking about it. Um, but I'm really grateful that you chose to spend your time here with me today, and I will see you next week.